Hi, students. So today we're going to be starting a new lesson on the Reign of Terror. And we're really focusing on this Reign of Terror because it's really the climax of the French Revolution. And in order to understand the context of the Reign of Terror, let's look first back at the phases of the French Revolution. So far, a lot of what we've looked at has been part of the so-called liberal phase of the French Revolution. This original phase, as the bourgeoisie are dominant, they are looking for a constitutional monarchy with guarantees of civil liberties and economic freedom. But we've started to see the French Revolution radicalize with legislation like the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. And when we look at the further radicalization with the onset of the French Revolutionary Wars. And so we're getting into the radical phase of the French Revolution. And this is really the peak of the radical phase when we look at the Reign of Terror. So as you can see here. So we can see radicalization between 1792 and 1794. And this is the really crazy part in 1793 and 1794, right? Now, an important thing to note is that the Reign of Terror did not even last 2 full years. I mean, it's really just about 1 year plus. The French Revolution itself is a very long development, but this is for some reason the most memorable part of the revolution, the Reign of Terror. And of course, when you're cutting off thousands of heads, that tends to happen. People remember that more. So as far as the origins of this Reign of Terror, it actually starts with the Jacobin clubs. Now, while originally those who were at the Estates General and in the National Assembly, they were wanting a constitutional monarchy, the Jacobins, as we remember from our previous lesson, they were wanting a republic. They wanted to abolish the monarchy and create a government that was a lot more like the republic that had just started in the United States. Now, the Jacobins, this is a term that's often thrown around, and really you've got two groups in the Jacobin clubs. You have the Montagnards, or the Mountain, and these are the more radical members of the Jacobin clubs. And then you have the Girondins, or the Girondins, and they were the less radical members of these clubs. So the Jacobin clubs were becoming more dominant as the French Revolution continued. And we see that dominance in this national motto of the Republic: liberty, equality, fraternity, or death. Now, that or death part ends up being taken out a lot of the time because it's kind of offensive. Maybe it's sort of hard to stomach, but there definitely was a mentality here, a desire to create a French Republic and to crush the enemies of the people within France. Not just these invaders from other countries, but people who might be helping them, people who may be monarchists or aristocrats living in France, people who might want the restoration of the old regime. So let's take a look at some key events of 1793. 1793 started with the execution of Louis the 16th in January. In April, the Committee of Public Safety was created, and this was an executive body. This is pretty much synonymous with the Reign of Terror. And in September, the Reign of Terror, uh, you know, formally begins. Now, this was an official program by the government. They referred to it as the Terror. This wasn't something that came up with historians later, or it's not a nickname or something like that given by historians. The Reign of Terror, was a formal program launched by the revolutionary government. And one of the first acts of the Terror was to execute Marie Antoinette, the wife of King Louis XVI, in October of 1793. Now, so what was this Committee of Public Safety? So the Committee of Public Safety, it was an executive body in charge of directing the war effort during the French Revolutionary Wars. And it also suppressed anti revolutionary activity. And one way that I remember this is because Committee of Public Safety spells COPS in the acronym. Now, obviously, I don't think that has anything to do with anything, who knows, but it's something that has certainly helped me in the past. And so I'll share it with you because they were like the people who tended to crack down, just like the cops do, if you're breaking the law. That's what the Committee of Public Safety did. Now, the dominant figure in the Reign of Terror was Maximilien de Robespierre, who was otherwise known as the Incorruptible. Now, Robespierre's goal was to create a so-called Republic of Virtue. He really wanted to bring down all of the elements of the old regime with vigor, and to create this republican sort of society along the lines of Enlightenment principles, specifically influenced by the philosopher Rousseau. Now, there is some corruption here, despite what his nickname would say. Not in terms of taking bribes or anything like that, but certainly some corruption of values. We think of Machiavellian politics. If we think about that, then we're thinking in terms of the end justifies the means. And this was true of Robespierre and the Mountain as they tried to create this republic of virtue. For instance, Robespierre was initially against capital punishment. He believed that humanity is, enlightened beyond that, beyond capital punishment. But Robespierre then caved in. The end justifies the means. Basically, if we want to create this republic of virtue, then we're going to have to shed some blood. I mean, you almost think of Thomas Jefferson's quote, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Now, I'm not saying that Jefferson would have approved of what's going on here, but certainly this idea that you can't create a republic without the shedding of blood, especially shedding the blood of the enemies of the people. Now, the French people take this principle and they run with it with the help of the guillotine, which was otherwise known as the national razor. Now, the thing about the guillotine is that there is some enlightenment about it. If you think about it, even though it's a gruesome instrument, often associated with the mass bloodshed of the Reign of Terror, this national razor gave people equality in death, and it also gave them a painless death. When you go back to the Middle Ages, for example, a nobleman would have been beheaded. You think about, for example, Henry VIII's wives. It wasn't divorced, hanged, died, divorced, drawn and quartered, survived. Instead, it was divorced, beheaded, died. That Henry VIII's wives got a dignified death because of their social position. Noble men and women were beheaded because of their social position. That was seen as a dignified death. And lower class people did not receive that. So under the old regime, this is something that people thought in terms of how they died. It was based on your social position. But now, everybody is dying via the guillotine, which is painless. You don't even have to tip the headsman. They're not going to miss and accidentally get your shoulder or something like that. So there's no chance of it missing, right? Now, the last time that capital punishment was used in France, it was actually used with the guillotine. The French continued to employ the guillotine as their primary method of capital punishment. I think it was, it was actually their exclusive means of capital punishment all the way through the 1970s, which was, if you think about it, it's less than 50 years ago, with the execution of the so-called pimp killer in 1977. And yes, the story is definitely as interesting as it sounds. This guy was an actual pimp and a killer, and so thus the nickname. So we've got to go after the so-called enemies of the people. Who are the enemies of the people? Now, of course, a lot of times when we say the people, when we say that, we mean just our specific faction of the people. And the French weren't so different in thinking of those terms. Now, first of all, we look at the left-wing right-wing dichotomy that we still use in Western politics today. Now, this originated with the French Revolution. So those who sat on the right side of on the right wing were the more conservative. You would have the monarchists and people who favored features of the old regime and having a constitutional monarchy and a king still. And then on the left wing, you would have the most radical elements of the Jacobin faction, the Montagnard, the Mountain. And so they were more radical. And then you have the Girondins, the Girondins, the more moderate types who didn't quite sit in the highest seats there, in the most radical seats. And so the Girondins were the more moderate group. Now, first of all, take out this conservative right-wing faction, and so you're left with these Republican factions. Now, of course, this faction was pretty easy to spot, and actually a lot of them got out. A lot of them escaped the monarchists. So emigres, as you can see this word up here, emigres, such as the DuPont family, who are a famous family that came to the United States, they left France. Emigres left France around this time. And now we've got all kinds of chemicals because the DuPont family came here. We've got all kinds of chemicals and racing and carpet that doesn't stain when you have an accident and stuff like that. So thank you, French Revolution, for bringing them here, having them escape here. All right, so, they're leaving France around this time, these emigres. Maybe not this exact time, but very close. Emigres, of course, were people who left France. Every immigrant to a country is also an emigrant from another country. And we see here 9 emigres being executed here by guillotine in 1793. Now, the guillotine was a very efficient punishment. They would execute lots and lots of people at one time. So if you were an emigre and you got caught trying to escape, you're obviously an enemy of the people, and you are going to die. Now, among those dying, of course, Marie Antoinette, the tragic queen of France, who said during her time of suffering, "Tribulation makes you realize who you are." And when we look at these two portraits right here that are not even 10 years apart, you see how this experience that she's going through has aged Marie Antoinette. This woman who, if she had lived a few generations before, would have had a charmed life, who didn't really do anything in particular to make herself such an enemy of the people, such a reviled person, except for saying something that she never actually said. Many Frenchmen mistakenly believed that she had said, "Let them eat cake," to the starving people of France, which obviously upset many French people when they heard that rumor. Many of them thought it was true. But again, she never actually said that. It was just a rumor. And so Marie Antoinette was executed in October of 1793. You see here this barbaric spectacle where her head is put on a pike and shown to everybody, and everyone is celebrating the death of their queen, including the neoclassical painter Jacques-Louis David, who sketched her on her way to her execution. And remember, David, so you see here, this is her head on the pike, and this is the drawing from David. And remember, David also, he did that tennis court oath picture that we looked at in one of our previous lessons. He's that same artist. So he sketched Marie Antoinette on her way to her execution. And now you see where she's being humiliated here. You can see here her hair up here has been cut short, right? Also, she's being forced to wear this hat, this French Republic cap, which of course is a symbol of abolishing the monarchy. And so David, maybe he meant to paint her later on, who knows? But eventually he decided, Marie Antoinette was not worth the painting. So he just left it like this. And then, of course, there is her son, who isn't talked about a lot, Louis Charles, Louis the 17th, who was the uncrowned king of France. And pretty much just like her, had he been born at any other time or in another life, he would have been king of France. And in this life, he was imprisoned and died. Her son died of the deprivations he experienced in prison, and also he was accused of incest with his mother and all kinds of horrible stuff like that. Basically, this whole family was just wrong place, wrong time, tragic. And nobody found the French Revolution more tragic than Edmund Burke, who was watching this all go down with horror from England. Now, of course, he had a back and forth debate with Mary Wollstonecraft, whom I've discussed in another lesson. She was another Enlightenment thinker. But let's look specifically at what Edmund Burke, the member of the British Parliament and a great thinker of his time, had to say specifically about the death of Marie Antoinette. He said, "Little did I dream that I should have lived to see such disasters fallen upon her. In a nation of gallant men, in a nation of men of honor and of cavaliers. I thought 10,000 swords must have leaped from their scabbards to avenge even a look that threatened her with insult. But the age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever." And what Burke sees here with the replacement of the old regime with this new regime that indulges itself in mass executions, he doesn't see progress here. That's what his quotes are basically saying. Now, Edmund Burke was a liberal conservative, so to speak, someone who believed in liberalism in the sense that we can have more freedom, but it needs to come in increments. He looks at the British, who have gotten their freedoms over time and who have built upon their existing system. And he predicted that the French were reinventing the wheel so very quickly and that this was going to end in disaster. And nothing was more disastrous to Edmund Burke than to see Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, executed so barbarically and nobody coming to her rescue. And here is the picture of Louis Charles, the son that I mentioned, the son of Louis XVI, who died in prison from illness at the age of 10 in 1795. And he was uncrowned, so he did not get to become king when he died. And so we're going to leave it there. Actually, we're going to leave the rest of it for another time. We're going to wrap up this first part of this lesson on the Reign of Terror. In the second part, we're going to address some other elements of the Reign of Terror, look at some of the specific policies, and also the fall of Robespierre and the Thermidorian reaction. So let me know if you have any questions in the meantime, and thank you for watching.